Hi again. I'll try to keep this last part really short. The People's Crusade is an effort to go all the way to Jerusalem. A lot of people, again, leave without any particular leadership other than just kind of, it's a large group of peasants. They do commit some horrific atrocities. These are not necessarily atrocities that were called on by Pope Urban, but this does happen kind of in some really, really horrific, incidents where a great deal of murder occurs, and there's also a long-term legacy of a great deal of increased mistrust between Jews and Christians, and also an uptick in anti-Semitism. So what kind of becomes a really big consequence of the Crusades is related to the People's Crusades, but the People's Crusade is really not part of the group that ultimately makes its way to Jerusalem in the First Crusade. Sorry about that. The Crusaders do ultimately travel to Antioch. They travel to Jerusalem. So after meeting up with the leaders in Byzantine, and there's a great deal of kind of a power play showdown that starts to happen. The Byzantines are going to want to insist that any land the Crusaders recover will go to the Byzantines. The Crusaders kind of promise, except for one person, and there's a lot of mistrust between these two groups. So they're kind of, allies, but almost not really. And the Christian Crusaders do find themselves in Antioch making a siege. Most of the crusading battles, happen with one group kind of surrounding the community of the other group and starving them out. And so in some cases, there is, a breach of the wall, and the group that was laying the siege ultimately gets inside the city. And in Antioch, there's largely some circumstances that enable the Crusaders to get into Antioch, and kind of a complicated siege, but they end up with control of that particular city and don't give it to the Byzantines. They actually control it and start to set up what becomes the Crusader states, essentially occupied territories in the Islamic Empire. There will be like European areas and European control, the Crusader states, where Europeans build castles and whatnot. The Crusaders do reach Jerusalem, and this is where some of the sources are particularly horrific in terms of the violence. Some of the sources, suggest that in the rampage of Jerusalem, about 70,000 Muslims were killed. There was a great deal of Jews also killed. Just like Jerusalem today, it's a very diverse area. There's a great deal of peoples who are living there, not only individuals who are Muslim, but people who are Byzantine Christians, people who are Jews. So there's a variety of people seeking, Jerusalem as their home, and there's a great deal of confusion as the Crusaders come into Jerusalem to acquire it. It is taken by the Franks, and from the Islamic perspective, this is not necessarily seen as a religious activity. This is part of, again, what's kind of a longer territorial timeline. The way in which it gets looked on later, and how historians, Islamic historians, write about the events later, might be kind of giving us this sense that there is a kind of a timeline, and the Crusaders are specifically referred to as the Franks, not necessarily as the Christians, at least from the Islamic perspective. Something that's important to note is there's a great deal of Islamic societies that are fighting for control of Jerusalem themselves, and so the Crusades, this 1095 time, happens in the bigger picture at a time when the Islamic peoples are not necessarily united. So there is an advantage, in a sense, to a degree, for the Crusaders, which are really a ragtag group that is not militarily organized to any significant stance. In some cases, has successful battles, but for the most part, the atrocities that occur are a big part of the aspect, and there's questions, in terms of the sources we have, how many people were killed, what type of violence was done, but the sources indicate that it was significant. The Second Crusades essentially is an effort to get back one particular Crusader state, which is the county of Edessa. So all these like kind of colored states over here, Edessa and Antioch and Tripoli, are all places that the Franks have kind of set up, and the Christians have set up their castles. We have a Seljuk Turk who captures Edessa, and there is like a kind of a piece taken out of what the Christian kingdoms were. The Christian Crusaders try to get it back, and they fail. The Third Crusade is significant largely because the context changes on the ground in the Islamic societies. There's a significant leader in the West referred to as Saladin. He is significant as a military leader. He had political experience in Egypt. He's of Kurdish descent, but he has some significant leadership experience, kind of pulls himself up the ranks in the political government in Egypt, and extends the role of the Islamic Empire to include Jerusalem. So Jerusalem falls back into the hands of the Islamic Empire, and the Christian Europeans will see now they're on like their third or fourth pope, who will call a new crusade. Each pope kind of that is following Pope Urban is calling for new crusades. In this case, the Third Crusade, some political leaders take the request, and so we get Richard the Lionheart from England. He will be one of the people out of a few significant leaders who try to come back to getting Jerusalem. Ultimately, Richard the Lionheart is not successful. Saladin and Richard the Lionheart kind of oppose each other for some time. There's also some efforts where they interact, and they ultimately do kind of reach, some people would argue, a truce. So in terms of success of this crusade, it depends what question you have for success. The Europeans are not able to maintain Jerusalem, or the control of Jerusalem. It falls into Islamic Empire hands, but a truce of sorts, and Saladin unites the Islamic societies around his effort, and there's also some power play where Saladin will enable Christian pilgrimages. How much that happens, but there is a kind of a truce of sorts, some diplomacy maybe we see. There is also the Fourth Crusade, which is kind of a nutty one. Without getting into too much detail, there's a Fourth Crusade, and there is an attempt to get Jerusalem back. This particular crusade, leads to so many difficulties. The Crusaders, who owe the Venetians for transportation, really get into the succession issues that are happening with the usurping of power in Constantinople. And so they get involved in Byzantine politics, pick a side, and ultimately will sack the city of Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade leaves a bad taste in everybody's mouth. It is, kind of the way in which the Crusades ends up becoming a Christian group on a Christian group. It seems to put in question anything that people believed or had as kind of the vision for the crusade, and it's like a corruption in a sense of what some people see. At the same time, it could also allude to what the real forces behind the crusades were. So how significant the Fourth Crusade is, it is significant because of ultimately what happens. It shares some important information about motivations, right, and what kind of people were perhaps after. Just to give you a sense of the discussion questions, the first one is about the role of religious piety. How much was religious piety perhaps motivation behind the First Crusade? And this might include a variety of different people involved in the First Crusade. We have different perspectives, the Muslim and as well as the Christian European perspective. There's also a great deal of maybe perspective that varies from person to person. The second question is very much a focus on sources. Do you see any differences in perspective between Muslim, Christian, and Jewish sources? And there's a few sources online for you to take a look at what might be kind of different in either the stories that are told, or in some cases the source might be from an historian, Ibn al-Athir, for example, from the Muslim perspective, or might be a transcript of somebody who experienced the Crusades, might be a primary source. And then the last question is probably the most challenging. Was the First Crusade a just war? You might even ask, is there such a thing as just war? The concept of just war theory is almost like a philosophical type of theory, and in what capacity should war happen? Should there be rules? Do societies set rules? And then also, in terms of going to war, and we saw a little bit of this, last week with some of the questions relating to the United States involvement in Iran. When and how and under what conditions is it acceptable, if ever, to go to war? And you might have certain opinions about that. It might be that, there is no ever justification for war, or maybe there is. And the definition we're using is kind of very, very biased, okay? It's just that it happens to be the one that was used at the time. A Christian, a significant kind of Christian leader and author, Augustine of Hippo. And this would have been kind of the ongoing philosophical, maybe kind of framework for particularly the Roman Catholic Church. So this just war theory has a Christian kind of bias to it. The way that Augustine lays out his just war theory, there are 4 different components of just war. It has to come from the right authority. That means whoever kind of calls the war has to actually have some sort of legitimacy. The second thing is there should be a right cause. Okay, what that means is debatable, but the cause should be right. There should be a proportional attempt to the war. So this came up as a question, for example, in the United States assassination of Soleimani, in recent current events. Is there a proportionality so that way if one, if somebody gets punched, is the, kind of response something that's much greater? Something that's proportional would be essentially a similar type response. And also, is war the last resort? Have there been other efforts to try to address the issue at hand and address the cause? How do we kind of look at this issue of just war? What the Crusades were is probably part of the debate. What a just war is, if that concept even exists, is part of the debate, and a little bit of some of the happenings of the First Crusade, and how do you assess some of this, from whose perspective, what would matter. So think about that a little bit, and we will see you in class.